And coming back to the economy, Brazil has gone from being largely an extractive economy to developing a series of distinct industries with their own acknowledged expertise. How did this come about, and what are the successful industries?
I think it's a slight simplification to see Brazil's, I mean, in some ways Brazil's become, there's a debate going on now about deindustrialization in Brazil, because what's happened in Brazil is that between from the 1940s onwards, Brazil built up domestic industry behind tariff barriers, serving a domestic market through import substitution policies, and it built up a fairly hefty domestic industry that was never very efficient, or parts of it were never very efficient, and large chunks of that have fallen victim to they've
greater levels of competition.
They've been restructured. Yeah, they've been great levels of competition, as you say. They've just been taken out. Now, Brazil's economic success, aside from the stability, is now one of the fundamental features of it is its redefinition of its comparative advantages. Okay, so Brazil is a commodity exporter, but to say that is to simplify what commodity export means in 2012. Brazil is the only one of the four BRICS that is completely self-sufficient in terms of food, in terms of water, and in terms of energy. And these are very, very important comparative advantages. So its advantages as a producer as an agricultural power, it directly mirror Chinese needs, so that China imports most Brazilian soya. So Brazil's the biggest producer of soya in the world. China buys most of it. Why does it use it? Because China has shortages of basic grains, which it uses as animal feed. China's population is becoming rapidly urbanized. It's eating more meat, and the soya is used as an ingredient. I think that's one of the central axes, as you like, of this new relationship.
Which is a south-south.
The south-south thing. China also imports a huge amount of high-quality iron ore. Brazil's the biggest producer of high-quality ferrous iron ore in the world, and why it's used for construction, it's used for the steel industry in China, it's used for all manner of consumer items. And Brazil's a big producer now of oil, and Chinese imports of Brazilian oil have been rising, and Chinese investment in Brazilian oil have been rising. So this is Brazil's been able to use its good fortune, in a sense, of having access to all these resources, and it's not limited by any means to soya. You've got more than a dozen agricultural products that Brazil's either first, second, or third in the world. It may not be very efficient as a manufacturer, but it's very efficient as an agricultural power. And one of the features of Brazilian agriculture is the way in which, under a government organisation called Embrapa, a research organisation, Brazil has been able to develop new technological approaches towards agriculture. It's developed seeds that can be sown and can work in arid areas. People say that the subsistence farm, you think of a subsistence farmer's productivity being one. The Green Revolution in India in the 1960s might have increased that to 3, the application of fertilizers and so on. Brazil's been able to increase that to 6, so it's doubled. It's squaring what India achieved in the 60s, and it's done that through this kind of application of technology on the back of tremendous resource advantages, because Brazil has huge amounts of water, one of its little known riches, in a sense. And then you look at other elements of this kind of resource story, ethanol. Program that Brazil started back in the 1970s under the military government. has allowed, 75% of Brazilian cars work on flex fuel, on an ethanol petrol mix. Huge advances in this area that potentially could become very important.
And presumably it has expertise, as with agriculture, in that area.
Yeah, they've got huge expertise. They've got a huge industry, and so when you say, that the industries they developed in the 50s and 60s don't work anymore, but then other industries are emerging that, and I think, the clever angle, in a sense, on this is to see the ways in which, industries like the pharmaceutical industry could develop on the back of, Brazil's biodiversity, which is extraordinary in the Amazon. A lot of pharmaceutical companies interested in Brazil, and a lot of Brazilian pharmaceutical companies emerging, looking to take advantage of this, to develop products on the back of this biodiversity.
As the country has got richer, it has become part of the BRICS group of countries. This seems to have led to it adopting significantly different positions in things like the WTO negotiations. Is it developing a different position from the countries it's left behind?
I think, Brazil's very pragmatic about free trade. When Lula took over 2002, their argument was, the big thing we are discriminated against as a tremendous agricultural comparative advantage. There's huge amounts of protectionism, obviously, on agriculture in both the US and Europe and Japan. And Brazil has led the charge in terms of trying to force concessions on that, and it's been reluctant to open up some of its own markets because it realises that there are huge things at stake here. Now, I think that's kind of understandable, actually. I don't think it's an unreasonable position. I think they continually press for greater openness in relation to agricultural exports, and obviously they've not had a huge amount of success. But I didn't think, I think you've had a bit of, Brazil's over the past year or two there's been some quite controversial measures taken to protect domestic industry from competition. There's a rhetoric about. I think Brazil's very conscious that as the North, the US and Europe have got into difficulty since 2008. That suddenly the rules have changed as regards the sort of free market consensus of the 1990s and 2000s, and the rules have changed, and Brazil keeps doing its own thing, and it's less willing to sort of receive lectures from free marketeers in the North about what it should and shouldn't do. Their argument is, look, we're doing what we're doing, we're actually okay, what about you? There's a kind of I think there's a greater self-confidence in Brazil. It's not that they are, Brazil... But
that's combined with a quite pragmatic address, isn't it? It's not...
Yeah,
they don't have to have an ideology behind it.
No, it's not ideological. I think there's a bit of nationalism in it, in some quarters, but in some quarters there's a bit of nationalism. It's not the dominant view. You talk to Brazilian politicians are surprisingly pragmatic. They want to get things done, and that, in a sense, is Brazil's history, right? That it's not a very ideological country. This is a country where the dominant mode of change has been very gentle reform. It's a country that evolved really from being, a slave-owning, monarchy, to a republic, to a, corporatist, almost semi-fascist dictatorship, to a liberal democracy, to, a social democracy without, well, through the period of military dictatorship, when, you know, with some blood was shed. I was going to say without blood being shed, it would be unfair to say that, but I mean, not right to say that, but actually it has been a much smoother historical process than we've seen in any of its Latin American neighbours. I mean, you know, you look at the period of military dictatorship in Brazil. In Brazil, between 1968 and 1985, when the military finally left power, general estimations of a few hundred people were killed in a population that's now, well, I don't know what it was quite then, but it's now 200 million or so. You know, in Argentina, we saw 30,000, perhaps as many as 30,000, I should say, people being killed in the period between 1974 maybe and 1982. In Chile we saw, this very surgical repression that Pinochet was the architect of. We saw, only as 10,000 people killed, a very tiny country. So by contrast, Brazil was pretty gentle. And you talk to Brazilians about that who were around in the 70s, and in some parts of the country it was barely visible. You go to somewhere like Salvador, no memory of the military dictatorship at all. It's not left its mark in the same way as it's left a very difficult legacy for Argentina and Chile. And on the wider, the longer term thing, I think there's been this kind of gentle evolution. I mean, Brazil tends to do things very slowly. During the 1990s, when everywhere else was liberalising, Brazil was dragging its feet. It did privatisation, but it privatised to a far lesser extent than Argentina or Mexico did. So that whereas Mexico and Argentina sold off all their state banks and they privatised many other state-owned companies, Brazil was kept its state-owned development bank, and it kept its Banco do Brasil state-owned bank, still a state-owned bank now. And of course that looks quite good. I mean, now Brazil's got 80% of the Brazilian banking system is in either the hands of the government or Brazilian business. And it's not as exposed to an extent as, say, some of its Latin American neighbours. So that's, there's been a product, so there's been a benefit in a sense from doing things slowly and not being quite so vulnerable to economic fashions. And I think that slow change is the Brazilian way, and sometimes it's very frustrating for people. It's frustrating for me when I live there. It's very frustrating. It drives you mad, the bureaucracy. You can't move without kind of someone asking you to pay a tax or something. But it's slowly getting it together.